So, Monica, I want to thank you again, I think on behalf of all of us, for it takes somebody from New York to help us know more about our local saint.
Your local saint.
Thomas Merton. So I wanted to, there's so many things I wanted to reflect on about what you said, but let me start off with something that you began with and talked about. You talked about the sacramentality, in Merton's strong sense of sacramentality, in the, that the earth was able to radiate God and manifest God. So at the end, you were talking about how we don't experience God necessarily, or we think we experience God in like holy days, like Christmas and holy times or churches and so forth. Well, there was I remember many years ago when I was in theology reading a survey done by Andrew Greeley, the famous sociologist.
Oh, yeah.
And it was a survey that he did asking people the question, where do you experience God? And he said, we theologians, or we people in church, tend to think that people would say they experience God at our religious services. Or certainly they must experience God when I'm giving a homily. Or certainly they must experience God when they're praying in church. But he said, no, by far, most people said they experience God in the natural world. That it's in the natural, it's in the beauty of a sunset, or you mentioned the silent rain or the greeting of spring and so forth, and those seem to be the moments that wake up people. Then why did Merton say, I have no scruples in loving this? What's the deal with, it seems like for him to put it that way, I have no scruples, means he feels like he shouldn't find God there. He should find God in the monastery, but instead he says, he wrestles. So is it what?
Okay, that's the young Merton, who has been in the monastery only 7 years at that point, when he says, I have no scruples about loving it. But remember, all of us are products of this Western Cartesian split between matter and spirit, and we think that matter is bad and spirit is good, and we've inherited that. It's part of the Western philosophy. Merton had that too, and he had to get over it. So I think when I latch onto that quotation, when he says, I have no scruples about loving it, it's the beginning of a conversion, of a transformation. So that's in the 1947 era, 1948. So then it's later when he says things like, I belong to this parcel of land and it was given to me. So each of us is on a journey. If we think of the whole world, or think of the new cosmology that someone like Thomas Berry has written about so poignantly, about the earth, the whole planet is sacred, that it is God-filled, and with the new cosmology that all of us are in evolution, and it is the unfolding of God's love, and we are part of that, 15 billion year story that is unfolding. That language was foreign to Merton, but that concept was coming through because of his prayer. That sort of answer, your sense? Well, that's the young Merton, and then the...
So Merton had to go through a conversion.
Lots of conversions. Lots of
So what would he say to us today about many people who feel like they have to, they don't find God in the natural world? In other words, many people feel like the natural world is simply a profane place, and yet the church is a sacred place. And even though our sensitivities or experiences tell us that we experience God in our everyday world, there's still like this mental block that we all have. So does Merton ever write about in any way to help us break through that, those scruples we might have?
Had he lived beyond age 53, I think he would have. But I think his that question at the end of the last public document we have from him called The Wild Places, is the name of that essay, when he says, can Aldo Leopold's ecological conscience be effective in America? I think there he's asking us, can we begin to see that there isn't a division between inner and outer, between matter and spirit, that all of this is an expression, an overflowing of God's diversity. Each of us is a face of God. Each creature is another face of God. And that's one of the things that the people that are so concerned about biodiversity And the extinction of species, that's another face of God that's lost. Something to think about.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Well, we want to add some more voices to the conversation as well, and I think Sister Claire McGowan, you've been reflecting on this for a while.
I've been reflecting on this for a while, as all of us here have. And I find it interesting that my thoughts are kind of shaped by 3 monks, all of whom are named Thomas. So it's my brother Dominican, Thomas Aquinas, who taught that, and this was in the 13th century, he taught that the natural world is the primary book of Revelation, and that, in a way, scriptures are secondary. So the first way we know God, Thomas Aquinas said, is in our experience of the beauty and wonder of the natural world. And then, as you've elucidated so beautifully, Monica, Thomas Merton, the Trappist monk, discovering the depths of God in the forests and the knobs, the sunrises, and the birdsong around his own Abbey of Gethsemane. And then, of course, many of us having been influenced by the third great monk, Joe's brother, Thomas Berry, in more recent time, and his writings have exponentially expanded our understanding of the foundations and the relationships that constitute that natural world. So all 3 of these Thomases, mystics and scholars at different moments in history, have sought truth and made such huge differences to humanity. In my own role as a sustainability educator and advocate, I would say first about myself that I'm a seeker of truth. Being a Dominican, we would assume that. But the truth that I eagerly seek is truth that can make a practical difference in how the world unfolds. And I suspect that many of us in this room seek that particular dimension of truth. So as we look at the questions today, mine are very practical ones about what does contemplation mean now? If it's true that the natural world is our first teacher of God's ways and God's wonders, then it's pretty clear that a lot of things have gone badly awry. One dilemma is that in this postmodern and urban and digitalized world, many people rarely contact the natural world at all. A second dilemma is that the notions of God that have been passed down to us over the centuries do not fit with our present understanding of the evolutionary process. And the third, of course, is the growing awareness that this magnificent natural world created over billions of years is now deteriorating rapidly at our own hands. So if Walter Burkhardt is right that contemplation is a long, loving look at the real, my question is, can looking long and lovingly at God revealed in the beauty and wonder of nature be sufficient for contemplatives in 2014? As the child asked the Velveteen Rabbit in that wonderful book of the 60s, what is real? Lately, the real has been hitting us over the head with stunning clarity. There's been many mentions over these days of the festival of the IPCC's 7-year report saying that the impacts of climate change are occurring throughout the world at unprecedented rates and faster than they ever anticipated. Then 2 weeks ago, we got the National Climate Assessment confirming that climate change is already affecting every region of the United States, and the impacts of it will worsen if we do not begin now to reduce seriously our fossil fuel consumption. Then last week, the World Health Organization reported deteriorating air quality in many of the world's cities, killing 7 million people a year. And 2 days ago came reports that the Antarctic ice sheet has begun an irreversible melting process. That is a lot of real to take in 1 month's time. So the information is clear that if we stay on the current path, there is little hope for health and well-being in the days ahead. But what will steer us off the current path and onto a new and healthy one? Would we dare to say that contemplation is the key to the human transformation so urgently needed right now? I tend to believe so, but I believe that at this time in the evolutionary process, we must conceive of contemplation more deeply and more broadly. My experience in working with faith communities around how do we as people of faith create a sustainable future, I often give a list of things that we can do to take home, and the first one is to pray. But I'm very quick to clarify to people, I do not mean to ask God to fix these problems for us. I mean to ask God to help us to see how we can find the wisdom and the courage, each of us, to do our unique part in transforming the world. Pretty different understandings of prayer. In working on the Bluegrass Pipeline, we've discovered many people know very little about state government, about the basics of local government. In working with the energy vision that the communities of Catholic sisters here in the Kentucky Holy Land have been promoting, we find that many Americans have very little understanding of greenhouse gases or fracking or the impacts of the Keystone Pipeline or of the positive potential of renewable energy. So what I'm getting at is if we're going to meet the enormous challenges before us, I think the religious traditions must stretch our understandings of contemplation. I think a long, loving look at the real today means that we need to learn how to discover God in the beauty and in the destruction of the natural world. So to look long and lovingly at the real means looking at and learning to understand the patterns, the policies, and the economic forces that are destroying the natural world. So I think contemplation today needs to include study, the disciplined work of learning what is going on with our energy systems, with our food systems. I think contemplation today must also include community, the web of loving and sturdy relationships that overcome isolation and create the possibility of making an impact on the larger world. And finally, I think that contemplation must include action, loving action for positive change. Perhaps a simple story best illustrates my message. The other day, as I was coming home from work, getting out of my car, my young 9- and 7-year-old neighbors came running toward me. "We saw a bird hatch. We saw it hatch. Do you want to come see it?" I shouted. These little girls had been contemplating the bird nest for weeks, their own long and loving look at the real. And they had been rewarded with a revelation that few adults have actually ever seen, the great mystery of new life emerging from a small blue robin's egg. Of course, I said yes, and we hurried over to the tree. And while we were going, they instructed me very confidently, "Now be very careful. Don't touch anything, or the mother might not come back. And we have to watch out for the possum." Seems that as these children engaged in contemplation, they were at the same time studying, learning the patterns of the birds and of their predators. In their contemplative process, they had formed community by enlisting their big brothers not to harm, but to help protect the baby birds. And they had created a plan of action to keep the possum away, yes, but also to invite others like me to come and contemplate with them. Now, what was it Jesus said about suffer the little children?
Very good. Thank you, Claire. Thank you. Sure, yeah. Well thought out and with passion. With passion. Well, I want to maybe get you and Monica talking for a moment about something you said that struck me, if that's fair enough to frame a question or discussion for a moment. You said that a long, loving look at the real can be a look at a lot of destruction. So it's not just finding God, in the beauty of the natural world, but God in the destruction of the natural world. And that reminded me of something that Thomas Berry said that was puzzling to me for a long time. He said, "What a privilege it is to live at a time when we can witness the withering of the earth in its Cenozoic expression." And he said, what a privilege it is to live at a time when we can witness the withering of the earth in its Cenozoic expression, meaning to witness the earth being destroyed as we know it now. So that seemed to resonate. That resonated with me when you said that. So does Merton ever speak about the, he took so many pictures of the natural world and spoke about the beauty of the natural world. Did he ever address that issue of the destruction? He was in touch with Rachel Carson.
Well, he was in touch with Rachel Carson, but I'm thinking what's coming to my mind is a letter from Czesław Miłosz, who criticized Merton for not taking any attention to the destruction and the terribleness of nature, the red tooth and claw approach of nature. And he said, you never talk about this stuff. Merton's response to him was, no, it's all part of the whole picture. I don't need to focus on that. It's part of, and so I think he would see it as a kind of wholeness or a rhythm of coming and going. But not exactly to skirt your question, but to go back to what you were asking Claire and talking about it, I'm thinking about the session we're going to have tonight on these photographs that are stunningly beautiful on ecological crisis moments, that here they come. And so it's not one or the other, but maybe it's another opportunity to take a long look at the real and say, oh, that picture, that photograph is stunningly beautiful. Now, what does that mean for me? How do I respond to it? There was another thought that was coming to me as you were talking about the importance for action. As part of Merton's spiritual evolution, first is the silence. Then there is the call to solitude. And then there is the developing of compassion and the turning toward the world. So compassion or prayer can never just be for oneself and one's happy feeling. It always has to move into how do we include all into it. And that requires some action. So as soon as you move from silence to solitude to compassion, that's when Merton had his turning toward the world movement and started writing about the dangers of technology and the important rights of indigenous people and the problems of war. When we became very vocal about those things. And then toward the end of his life, we get a little sense of that he sees justice is also eco-justice, justice for the planet. And I'm always saying that had he lived longer, we would have gotten a seminal essay out of him. But I think there are enough little senses there. So he would agree with you. This has got to evolve into action. And that it calls us together for community, too, that we don't do it alone.
And that as religious leaders, we need to figure out how to pick up on that. You know, it may well be there in Merton, but how do we as a faith community help our people, help our communities, help ourselves to discover that unless we're willing to learn, to study, to understand what's going on, we can't really have a real relationship with God. I think that message is not being preached as effectively as it needs to be.
Right. Well, how does that tie in with the sacramental theology? I mean, you're a Catholic nun, Catholic sister, so sacramental theology is a big part of your life. How does it, because they often, you hear theologians talk about if the waters are polluted, then how can we have baptism in polluted water? But do you think we can have baptism in polluted water?
Well, we do.
Yeah, we do, sure. But you know the point, in other words...
We obviously do.
Yeah.
I think in the Catholic tradition, we've narrowed the focus so much on 7 sacraments that in some ways it's been a disservice because we sometimes fail to recognize the sacramentality of everything.
We used to call them sacramentals.
Yes.
Yeah, little mini sacramentals. Yeah.
Right. I think there's a foundation there that we could build in from the Catholic tradition that would be a gift to the world, but we've got a lot of work to do to make that gift
sure, but
as
there's a foundation and heritage there,
Right,
but
right.
that could be brought forth in a new expression in this case. Yeah, it'd be fascinating to look at how we can take polluted water and make it a sacrament. It's an interesting piece. Let me ask Kyle, so you come at this as a organic farmer, as somebody, you said in the Benediction tradition, who's rooted to the land, and then also as a director of a lay formation program. So you've been thinking about this as well.
I have. And, Merton's journey at Gethsemane was in many ways, I think, a healing journey. You see how he evolves there. And I've had my own healing journey. And so I wanted to share just sort of a very practical kind of narrative of what happens essentially when you read way too many Wendell Berry books. And,
is that possible?
You can't quite get to the end of 50, but I want to start this story with a confession. I probably should in a room like this. I was not always sort of an earnest, tree-hugging environmentalist. I actually grew up in southern Indiana with a jacked-up four-wheel drive pickup truck and a dirt bike tearing through the stripper pits. So I've had my own sort of conversion, and I've seen both sides of this. Was also a pyromaniac Boy Scout, and those are my chief connections with the natural world, is tearing it up. But then I went to college at IU, and I encountered Scott Russell Sanders. If you haven't read any of his stuff, I'd highly recommend it. And he became a mentor to me through his writing and personally, and he introduced me to Wendell Berry, his works, and Wendell personally. And frankly, they ruined me. They ruined that life I'd had. They woke me up to the need of a healthier relationship between us and the rest of creation. And I wasn't exactly sure what to do with that epiphany, besides, of course, selling my truck and my dirt bike. And so it took the rest of college and several years of graduate theology study. And what I finally realized was what was most important to me was actually a kind of lifestyle, more so than a particular job or career. I wanted a way of life that looked like putting roots down in a particular place, living simply, doing healing work on a small piece of land, very much like Merton was called to this stability of life at Gethsemane. I, of course, wanted to do Daniel Boone and go off grid and grow everything myself and maybe end up as a full-time organic farmer. That would be living the dream. And it was a totally romantic dream, of course, but sometimes that's what it takes to get you to take a leap of faith. And I searched and searched for a patch of land in Indiana, and I finally found one, and the only reason I could afford it was because it was utterly ruined. It had been cropped to death, the timber had been cut out of it, it was eroded, it was overgrown. So we're talking about witnessing the destruction of nature. I saw it on this piece of ground, and yet, as I stood on that piece of ground, amidst its ruin, it spoke to me, and it said home. And it said, Kyle, I know you have all these kind of world-changing big dreams, but if all you ever do is invest yourself here in this place and work for its healing, that's enough, and everything else is gravy. So hearing that voice, I took the leap of faith, and I sold off stuff, I bought the land, and I came back to try and make a go of farming. And I really did it the hard way. I camped on this land for about a year with no heat, no electricity, no running water, no toilet, a 5-gallon bucket for a toilet. And as I built a bachelor cabin and a farm and tried to make something of this ruined land. And I remember oftentimes sitting there as mice are scurrying around me and I'm swatting mosquitoes thinking, okay, so this is what all these years of graduate school have done for me. Thank you a lot, Wendell Berry. But as they say in Monty Python, it got better. I think what made it so hard was not just the rough circumstances, but feeling like and Wendell actually uses this language, and it haunted me for a long time, feeling like I needed to be worthy of the place. Like I couldn't admit that I didn't actually know what I was doing and that I wasn't exactly sure how to heal this place. I had the principles and I didn't have the practice. And I remember I was I was trying to clear one of these overgrown fields with this junky old tractor that I bought and tried to keep running. And of course it dies on me. And that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. And I literally threw a temper tantrum in the middle of the field. I started throwing my wrenches into the woods and screaming at this machine that wouldn't run. And I turn, and about 20 yards from me is this guy walking across the field who turns out to be a new neighbor of mine who stopped by to see who had bought the old Brinkman place. And so, of course, he's seen this whole tirade. And I kid you not, he comes in, he fixes this tractor with a piece of baling wire. He gets it running. And I was kind of stunned at the whole situation. And I try and thank him. He says, no problem. Welcome to the neighborhood. And I realized then that I didn't have to know it all. What I had to do was be willing to admit my ignorance and to depend on others, to be welcomed into that community. And it wasn't just being welcomed into the neighborhood per se, it was being welcomed, I think, into the largest neighborhood. There was another time, a few weeks after having met John, I was doing chainsaw work all day, clearing trees and things like this. And it was, if you've ever worked with chainsaw, it's dirty, it's noisy, it's destructive work in a lot of ways. And so I felt a great deal of ambiguity about that. And I ended the day, and I sat in the back of my truck as the sun went down. It was November, it was cold, I was shivering, but I waited until the sun went all the way down, and the sky became black, and the stars came out, and where I live, you can see that stripe of the Milky Way kind of stretch across the sky. And I think that was my Fourth and Walnut moment. Mm-hmm. That was the time when I heard that the ground rules of the universe are mercy and forgiveness, and that even my kind of stumbling, ambiguous efforts were enough. I felt, sitting in the back of my truck, looking up at those stars, that I was part of something larger, something much more wonderful, the cosmic dance, I think, to use this language. I felt like I belonged, not by my own willpower and skill and cleverness, but by gift and by grace. And I eventually also felt welcomed in marriage and family life. The person who cut my hair said, the way you're living, Kyle, you are doomed, either to bachelorhood or to a mail-order bride catalog or something like that. But I was fortunate enough that a Louisville priest friend of mine introduced me to a wonderful woman who was not afraid to live an hour from the nearest Starbucks. And but she did want a flush toilet, so
you compromised.
So yes, marriage and family life have certainly led to compromise on the land. But what that's ended up showing me is that it is not just about me living out these kind of narcissistic environmental ideals, so that I could have a clean conscience and I could have bragging rights about how green I was. It wasn't about me at all, is what I came to learn. It was about my kids and your kids and everybody's kids and the poor and future generations. It was part of that broader community. So very quickly, what have we done in 15 years on the same patch of ground? With the help of friends and family, we eventually built a real house, not the kind of excuse for a bachelor pad that I had first constructed, and it is it's very green. It's passive solar. It's got wood heat. We capture all our rainwater. We have all our hot water is solar heated, and we now have solar panels, so many such that we sell power back every month. So I guess we're net positive. And the farm didn't turn out like I thought. I didn't end up being a full-time organic farmer, but I've moved from, and in the beginning years, larger scale market farming, and now toward, if you're familiar with this term, permaculture, or smaller scale, sustainable, mostly subsistence farming, although we still do some market sales as well. And we have learned a lot. I'm going to cut out a little bit for the sake of time, but I would say we've learned three things in terms of a healing journey, which I think relates to what we've been talking about with Merton and others. And first of all is that although it's undeniable how destructive we can be as human beings and as a race, our deepest human nature is to be healers. I really think that the truest form of earth care is not simply fighting destruction, although of course we have to do that, or trying to be sustainable, although of course we have to do that. The point, I think, is that at our core, we are not a cancer. We are not a planetary plague. our deepest vocation is to be healers. It's in our nature to help the earth flourish and thrive more than it could without us. And so we're called to leave these places better and more beautiful than we found them. And we can do that if we listen to our inner nature. But this doesn't happen through raw moral willpower and workaholism. I have tried those things for years and they don't work. I've tried to be blameless. I've tried to fix everything. And I have gotten myself stuck in deep depression and the paralysis of perfectionism. And what our farm has taught me, very practically, very hands-on, is that the world is fragile and damaged, but it's also tremendously forgiving and resilient. It wants to heal. I think that's my second point about the healing journey. The earth wants to heal. And if we simply start listening to the rest of nature and working with her rather than against her, if we just make the smallest efforts along with the big efforts, the world and actually the whole universe will rush in to help us. That right there is the core of my hope for the future. And finally, kind of point number 3 about the healing journey is that and this I think ties in the sense of spirituality we've had in our journey on the farm, is what healing work requires of us ultimately is listening. A great deal of patience and humility. And obviously, these are spiritual practices. And if we cultivate them, I think we'll find that we're not simply helping to heal our land and our air and our waters, but we are being healed along the way, each one of us and all of us as a community. And we're being healed by a mystery that's far greater and more wonderful than we can name.
Very good. Thank you. You reminded me, as you spoke about your own struggle with wanting to be able to do it perfectly and be able to get it all right. I know many people hesitate to get involved in this whole enterprise of engaging the earth because they feel so like not even a novice. We've lost the ability to have a rapport with the natural world. It's like, where do we begin? It just seems overwhelming because it's like asking somebody to do ballroom dancing and you can't even walk. And thus so many people fumble. So what would you say to somebody like that? I mean, I know you struggle with your own, you said perfection, but you were way down the road. So how do you address that today? You're a teacher and you work with people who are beginning to engage these issues. So how do you encourage them, those that have no sense of connection?
This is going to sound unorthodox, but I would say stop reading gardening books. Stop reading books about the environment. I'm kind of saying this tongue-in-cheek, but my experience is people who are passionate enough to take the time to write a book are often quintessentially good at what they write about, and they give you the impression that you have to be too. And so the minute I was willing to set aside some of the rule books and jump into making my own mistakes and step back from the ego investment that I had in getting it right, and realizing it was okay to do it halfway at first and then to learn from that. So I would encourage people simply to jump in and make those mistakes.
So don't read.
There's a footnote there, but yes.
I got it. I know when I was first got involved in this, and I would begin to pick practices, things I wanted to do. And so it became rather clear to me that being a vegetarian was one of those things. But I still am invited to speak different places. So like yesterday, I just flew back from giving a workshop about a 3-hour plane ride. And so when I began to become a vegetarian, people said, but look at how much you travel. And so you can't do it all at once.
Right.
And so I realized you can't expect to be consistent when you get involved in this. You can't expect consistency in myself or in other people.
Embrace your inner hypocrite.
Exactly. Yeah. What do you think Merton did he have anything to say about Kyle framed it as a healing journey, about the healing capacity of the earth, or the capacity of the earth to heal us, not just to be a sacramental presence, but also to be a healing presence.
Not in those words, although several times he would say something like, this is the most important moment of my life, or this is the most important experience that I've had. And I remember Bill Shannon saying to me one time, he says that 8 or 9 times in his journals, just don't pay attention to it. It was his kind of catchword for this is an experience of wholeness for me. One of the things, people have asked me what I'm going to do now that I am 3 days retired from Nazareth College, what I'm going to do next, and I want to explore Merton's interest in Celtic spirituality, which is a way of looking at streams of wholeness. In the last 4 years of his life, Merton kept reading a lot of books about Celtic spirituality and has more than 175 pages of handwritten, hard to read, notes from books that he's taken. And I think it was this notion of wholeness, not so much healing, but wholeness, and a sense of affirmation for him of what the early Celtic monks were doing and committed to, that he's beginning to see comes full circle in his life, and that the ancients are doing things that he has discovered. And also some of his roots are Welsh, so he's interested in that from a genealogical perspective. But I think that's where the healing notion comes in.
With the wholeness.
Sense of wholeness.
The idea of wholeness. Yeah. I just had to give a talk to on an interfaith symposium on the Christian perspective of the ultimate goal. And they asked me to give a talk on the concept of salvation. So I was doing some research on the etymology of the word salvation, which of course is it's the primary way Christians speak about the ultimate goal. Yeah, and it comes from actually a Sanskrit word that means all, the totality. Mm-hmm. So it came from that. But we also have the word salve, which means an ointment to bring about healing, or salubrious, which means well-being and health. And so the actual word salvation doesn't mean a destination out there. It's not salvation as some other place beyond the world, but rather it's a wholeness or completeness that we can experience in this lifetime.
Yeah.
So.
Tim's been silent for too long.
That's exactly what I wanted to say. I was exactly going to get a segue into Tim, because Tim is the executive director of KIPL, Kentucky Interfaith Power and Light, which is a national organization. The Interfaith Power and Light organization is, but Tim is our Kentucky executive director, and also a great advocate for living locally. And so how do you, well, let me ask what you've thought about this, so maybe you can bring forth what you've been thinking about, and then I have a question.
Well, throughout this I've been thinking, what can we take away from this? What message can we learn from Merton as we're facing the greatest environmental crisis, as Sister Claire was talking about, this climate change that's overwhelming, depressing at times. It's so big, as you mentioned. It's so hard to even think, how could we react to this? But I think there are two things that we can take away from Merton that he has to offer. One is contemplation, and the second is living simply. Contemplation, of course, is the very beginning and helps us to take a step back, to get out of this society, this consumptive society that is moving so quickly and is such a strong force that it seems like we don't have a lot of choices in our lives. A lot of the choices are made for us. It's moving us in a direction. And if we can stop and take a step back and find those times where we can live more contemplatively and be mindful of our actions and the way that we're living our lives, this interconnectedness with other people, with God, with all of nature is very important. This interbeing, as Thich Nhat Hanh calls it, because we cannot stop ourselves from interbeing. We are connected to all things, through the air, through the water, through the soil, and our decisions will have an effect on the rest of the world, whether we want to or not, and they will either have a positive effect or a negative effect. And so on a daily basis, there are decisions that we can make. And if we don't take a step back and be mindful of that, then those decisions, we will just get into the habits that we have. We will listen to Madison Avenue, and who tells us that we need to keep buying and consuming and help the economy. So being more mindful of what we're doing and looking at these little steps that we can take, because the little steps do add up to big steps and make a big difference. We probably all have a small list of things that we should be doing, things maybe we've heard about here at the festival, things we've heard from Wendell Berry or Kyle or Sister Claire, of things that we can be doing in our lives, and maybe take some time each day to contemplate that and start living more simply. It was probably easy for Merton to go to Gethsemane and live in a community like that where it's very simple. It would be more difficult for us living in the world to be able to do this. It's very countercultural. But there are many simple things that we can do. I talked about reducing consumption. So reduce, reuse, recycle, but that very first one is the most important. Pre-cycling, they call it. Think before you buy things. Instead of immediately going and getting something, give yourself some time to think about it. Is this something I really need? Is this something that's life-giving? And if not, maybe I don't need to buy it at all. And if you are going to buy something that's reusable. There's so many times we buy things that we use for just a minute or less and throw it away and it goes into a landfill forever. And so thinking about those little steps. My wife and I did this with our electricity use. We became aware of things like mountaintop removal coal mining and how it's destroyed over 500 mountains in Appalachia, filled in over 1,000 streams. That's a million acres in Appalachia gone forever. And we wanted to make a difference. So we looked at our electricity use and we started cutting back. We got compact fluorescent light bulbs and we started turning off the television instead of just having it on all day. And we went to ceiling fans instead of air conditioning and Energy Star appliances. And these things don't sound like they're that big. But over a 5-year period, we were able to reduce our electricity use by 70%. And so these little things really do add up. We're some of the biggest wasters of electricity here in Kentucky because we have some of the cheapest electricity. And then looking at our transportation, riding the bus whenever you can, walking, biking, or simply not going to a place. I found myself going to a doctor all the way across town or a movie theater across town when there's one close by, or simply going out and spending time with the neighbors. Spending time outside, starting your own garden. We have a pretty good sized garden in our backyard, and spending our time doing that rather than driving somewhere or something that consumes electricity, connecting more with friends and family and being grateful for all that we have in creation. And that living simply has been very meaningful for us. It's something Merton got a lot out of, and it goes hand in hand with contemplation. So that's the two things I feel I got out of Merton's writings and listening today.
Yeah, very good.
Good.
Very good. I think I know I work with Tim, so I think you bring simplicity in your own life. You bring simplicity to great complexity. No,
Well, my wife often said there's nothing simple about living simply.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's simpler to eat at McDonald's.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah. Simpler to eat at McDonald's. Right. Exactly. In many ways. But what was your? Kyle talked about one of his moments, and Sister Claire talked about her 3 Thomases, and we talked about Merton's. What was your epiphany moment?
You know, I never had that big conversion like Paul did on the road to Damascus or anything like that, but it seems like there's small things, little things. Just, going fishing with my grandfather when I was 10 years old, and he was a hunter and a fisherman, and he also lived through the Depression, and so he understands not wasting and, just an appreciation for nature and the importance of leaving a place in a better condition than when you got there. People that I've met through the years and gleaned a little bit about them through the years. I was taught by Ursuline sisters at St. Francis of Assisi School, and so an appreciation for St. Francis of Assisi and the importance of that, being in Boy Scouts and a lot of the important lessons I learned there.
He must have been in a different troop.
Yeah, we were in a different troop, yeah. And growing up in the 70s, and there was just a lot of understanding of the connection to nature that I'm very grateful to have had that experience.
So it just came about, but people in your life that helped wake you up to it.
That's right.
Yeah, very good. Well, thank you. Thank you. Monica, do you have
I have the
anything?
last word on this, or something.
Well, I'm going to let
that's-
Merton have the last word,
Okay,
but you
yeah,
have the second to
Merton had
last word.
I'm thinking of Sister Elaine Prevalette, who's a sister of Loretto who lives south of here. And she talks about pockets of hope. I think that Merton is a pocket of hope as we look at his spirituality. I think this festival is a pocket of hope in all of the people that have spoken, and I'm thinking of all the people that are out there still. Each of you is a pocket of hope for whatever you can do in your little small sphere of circle. If we're all a web and connected, it makes a difference. It's it. So just saying pockets of hope.
Pockets of
Take
hope,
that phrase
yeah.
with you.
And La Pente Vierge, you know,
La Pente
the
Vierge.
glory of God within us. And I think if we could, the more we can see the glory of God, Merton said, if we could only recognize that glory of God at all times within us,
Yeah.
meaning our sacred self, but also if we can only recognize that glory of God in the sacred earth. I think it's a huge step to say that the earth itself is sacred, not just that it manifests the sacred. It's a big difference between saying the earth manifests or is a sacrament of the sacred, but to say the earth itself
It
is
is.
sacred
It is.
means that it also, like ourself, is filled with soul. And it too is radiating the glory of God.
Our buttons. You are sacred. I am sacred. And you are also to the earth. We say that.
Very good. So with that, let's take 1 minute and we'll sound the gong and take 1 minute to just hold in our hearts that glory of God within us and let that La Pente Vierge come forth for a moment. So I'll ring the gong and then a minute we'll have for silence as we've been doing. That's been our tradition here to begin and end the sessions with a moment of silence. So if you feel comfortable closing your eyes, please do so. There's going to be an opportunity for the conversation to continue because as we leave, we all pass through the lobby and there's refreshments there. So please feel free to linger if you can. There's refreshments with wine and cheese, among other things, so we can have a chance to continue the conversation.
I'll do book signing.
Oh, that's right. And Monica will be there to do book signing as well. And Kyle. Kyle too, also, yeah. And then don't forget that tonight there's another session from 7 to 9, and it's going to be a multimedia presentation it's on reflections through art. So as Monica mentioned, from Henry Fair's photographs, we'll be looking at the images of the earth in crisis, and that'll be through those photographs. But also there'll be excerpts from a film on Wendell Berry and the agrarian life, and the filmmaker, Laura Dunn, will be here, called 40 Pains. So it'll be a multimedia presentation here from 7 to 9, and I think tickets are still available for that. And then also there's one more added workshop tomorrow We have the regular scheduled program, and it's in your booklets or in the schedule. But tomorrow afternoon at 12:45, there's going to be a workshop. It'll be a 90-minute workshop on sacred living within the home. So maybe it's following up on what Tim asked with being contemplative, but also looking at ways we can live more simply in the home through intention, prayer, and ritual, and to bring spiritual presence into our ordinary, everyday family dynamics. So it's going to be a 90-minute workshop on sacred living within the home tomorrow at 12:45. So thank you very much. Thank you, Tim, for coming. Kyle, Claire, thank you for your comments and reflections. And of course, Monica, thank you so much for coming to be with us during this festival and helping us to recognize the sun shining within our earth,
Yes.
within ourself, and within the sacred soil. So thank you very much. Thank you all for coming as well. Thank you.